Hello and welcome to Open Book, a podcast by National Records of Scotland dedicated to preserving the past, recording the present and informing the future. The 6th of April 2020 is the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Arbroath, perhaps the most famous and important of Scotland's historic documents. Drafted in 1320, it's a powerful call for the recognition of the Kingdom of Scotland's sovereign independence, and it's a key treasure in the National Records of Scotland archives. Dr. Alan Borthwick is head of early modern records at NRS. He studied the Declaration and other documents from the period throughout his career, and in this talk he answers many frequently asked questions about it. Where was it written? Who wrote it and when? And how have perceptions of its meaning and importance changed through the centuries since it was created? Dr. Borthwick refers to images of the Declaration throughout his talk, and while you don't need to see these to listen in, you can find them at our webpage, blog.nrscotland.gov.uk.
So, the Declaration of Arbroath. Scimus sanctissimi pater et domine, et ex antiquorum gestis et libris collegimus quod inter caeteras nationes egregias nostras scilicet Scotorum natio multis preconiis fuerit insignita. The opening few lines of the Declaration of Arbroath, the main text, not actually the start of the document, but which actually starts off the first 10 or so lines with just a list of names, the senders. When we think of DOA in the office, perhaps there are two initial ways of looking at it. One, which will I'm sure be how we in NRS in particular think about it, is with a document that we hold, one which I just had up on the screen a minute or two ago, the sealed duplicate of the letter that was sent to the Pope 700 years ago. A second way of looking at it is to think of it as a text, and what that meant then and later. In other words, the format of the sealed duplicate that NRS preserves is less significant than the phrasing within the document. Today I'll be trying to do a bit of both. For those who want to know more than it's possible for me to cover in a brief talk, a lot has been published about the Declaration. Indeed, it's one of a handful of British archive documents which have been the sole subject of books, let alone articles. Unsurprisingly, therefore, there have been many discussions about how to interpret particular clauses within the Declaration, and other historians might, I expect, emphasise different things, but the variety of published articles and books suggests that there's plenty of room for different approaches. There's some agreement amongst historians that there are three stages to a study of the Declaration: the immediate context of its compilation, its reception in the later Middle Ages onwards, and finally, how it's currently viewed by the world at large as much as by historians. In my talk today, I'm mostly focusing initially on the first stage, that is, the immediate context of its compilation, with some reflection on later opinions. I'll later be looking at how, from our own perspective, we've tried to facilitate access to our sealed duplicate over the last 200 years or so. So, very, very basically, that is what the Declaration is. I'm not going to read this out. So it's the letter of the 39 named earls and barons and so on sent to the Pope. And it's in Latin, as I'm sure you'd probably quite well imagine. But equally, I couldn't put up this slide saying what the Declaration isn't. So it's not really a declaration, actually. I mean, this is just it's a nice, handy term. It is very much a modern term, to be honest, as you'd imagine. Almost certainly it would have been only called the Declaration of Arbroath well after the 1776 American Declaration was commonly styled the Declaration of Independence. I'm afraid I don't actually know when that was, but I guess it was probably sometime in the 19th century. It's not a letter sent by the Scottish King, of course, either. It's sent by the barons, nor is it a letter sent in his name. I'm afraid it's not likely originally to have been drafted at Arbroath either, and it's not likely to have started its journey to the papal court on the 6th of April 1320. At least this is the view that some historians take. This is one of these things that's really very difficult to prove, and some of it I do accept this is splitting hairs, but it is not impossible to imagine that it might have started its journey to the papal court sometime in May, but it really is guesswork, I have to say. So, starting at the end of the document, which is where the date comes in, where was the Declaration drafted or written? So historians reckon that there was a meeting of Robert I's main council of advisors at Newbattle late in March 1320, when the content was settled upon and arrangements made for its sealing. So the Declaration dated at the monastery of Arbroath, the location of the King's Chancery or Writing Office. King Robert's Chancellor, Bernard, was the abbot of Arbroath, and the letter was actually written by one of the chancery scribes. Doesn't mean to say it was drafted by one of the chancery scribes. It was the actual writing. There's absolutely no doubt about that. On a map, which I know is barely legible even if you're sitting right at the front, it doesn't really matter, to be honest. It shows the place dates of royal charters issued under the King's Great Seal between the years 1317 to 23, and an awful lot of them are at Arbroath. But it doesn't actually mean that the king was there all the time. Arbroath is about 20 odd, but there's about 40 at Berwick and there's a few at Newbattle and elsewhere. So, as I say, it doesn't necessarily mean that the king was always there. This very, very brief summary possibly gives a better idea of where King Robert was around the time when the Declaration was being drafted and written and then dispatched. As an example of the difficulty of working out where the king was, as against where the charters were issued, Robert was definitely at Liston on the 11th of April, which was actually no doubt about that, west of Edinburgh, but the Crown Charters issued as a result of transactions on that occasion were dated in May. So obviously quite a time before the actual documents themselves, as a result of that particular set of transactions, were drafted, as far as the transfer clerks were concerned, were formally dated. Hence why I say that it is quite difficult sometimes working out where the king was, as against maybe where some of the chancery clerks were. The abbot, Bernard rather, obviously the abbot of Arbroath, and that's where he would tend to be if he wasn't actually with the king. But certainly the royal chancery was based there, and that's where a lot of the documents were dated. Hence, probably why it's dated at Arbroath. So the period from 1286 to 1320 is a remarkable one in Scottish history. In 1286, an adult king, Alexander III, died suddenly. His granddaughter, the only clear heir to the Scottish throne, died aged 7 in 1219. The English king, Edward I, then adjudged who, of a slew of competitors to the vacant Scottish throne, should be the next Scottish king. That's John Balliol. That king, John Balliol, surrendered his throne to Edward less than 4 years later in 1296. For 10 years, there was no resident Scottish king, and fighting and plotting to secure the throne demanded the attentions of 3 major European powers. That was the papacy, France, and England. In 1306, the vacant throne was seized in a dramatic coup by a man, King Robert I, who then had to convince sceptics that his claim to the throne and ability to retain it were in no doubt. You might think that Bannockburn, 1314, would have settled the matter, but it didn't, neither in Scotland or beyond. Robert I and Edward II continued to aggravate each other, as Edward not abandoned the long-standing English claim to overlordship in Scotland. And the Pope, who still did not recognise Robert I as king, intervened by excommunicating both Robert and 4 of his bishops, demanding that they appear before him in spring 1320 to answer for their misdeeds. So the Declaration was part of the Scots' diplomatic counter-offensive. This rather breathless summary is only most of the key stages